Hello everyone, and welcome back to another cartography lecture video. And in this lecture video, I want to delve into our discussion on fonts and typography. And what I want to do first is just kind of describe what a font is, right? What is a font? Simply put, a font is just the artistic rendering choice that we make for how to display letters on a screen or on a paper medium. Right, so a font is just, again, it's just an artistic rendering of letters on a screen or page. Now, there are a lot of sort of aspects of a font that help sort of define and characterize it. And what I want to do is I want to actually go through some of those characteristics that are the most vital for understanding in terms of both picking the appropriate font for a given application, but also for things that you want to watch out for when we start talking about label placement. So what I've done here is I've got two words, Fox's Rock, and hopefully you can see here that they're actually in two different fonts. Let me make a line here. So we have two different fonts or font families. The one on the left here, this is Times New Roman. And the one on the right here is Calibri. Now you can tell that they're different fonts because they just look different. And again, right, a font is just an artistic rendering, right? It's the way that somebody chose to draw, for lack of a better word, the letters so that when you type them on your keyboard, they show up in a certain way on the screen and are printed when you go to print them. So let's talk about the anatomy of a font. Because understanding the anatomy of the font is really going to give you the power to make good choices when it comes to picking fonts and understanding maybe how you can avoid some issues or how you can improve the overall appeal of your layout. So the first thing that we need to be aware of is what's called the baseline. The baseline, I'm going to show this in red here, or orange here. The baseline is the bottom of all the flat letters of a font. It's basically, where are we starting from? If we were to line a ruler up, where would the bottom of the letters be? That's called the baseline. The next key term we need to be aware of is how high, right? How tall is our font? And that's typically measured in something called X height. So X height is the height of a lowercase x. So this distance right here, this is called X height. And that's the height of a lowercase x above the baseline. The height of a lowercase x above the baseline. Okay, X height is going to be one of the most important components of a font to keep track of, because that's really going to determine, we'll talk about point sizing here in a minute, but X height is really going to determine more than almost anything else how big the font actually looks for a given point size relative to other font types. So X height is going to be really important. I'm going to put a star here. Understanding X height is going to be really important. Another way that we can measure the height of a font is with the cap height. So cap height, as the name might suggest, so this is called cap. This is cap height. Which, as the name might suggest, is the height of capital letters above the baseline. Capital letters above the baseline. So again, X height and cap height are going to be two of the big components of font that you're going to want to keep track of for determining whether a font will look bigger or smaller at a given point height, which again, we'll talk about point height in a second. Another thing that you need to be aware of with font is actually going to be the reason why I have two different fonts here. And that is something called serif versus sans serif. Serif versus sans serif. Now, if you're at all familiar with Latin, you might recognize the word sans here. You might recognize the word sans here as meaning without. So basically, this is a serif versus something without a serif. And if you're not familiar with what a serif actually is, I'm going to do this in red here. Right, a serif is these little markings. They look like feet or little lips that you see on various letters. These little lips, these are called serifs. So these right here are called serifs. It's a stylistic choice, again, because a font is just an artistic rendering. Right? It's a stylistic choice of whether or not we want to include them, like we do on the letters in Times New Roman, or if we don't want to include them, for example, in Calibri. And you can see with Calibri, right, the bottom of the R's, the edges of the K's, right, we don't have the same serifs here. So this font here, let's do blue, right? So this font here, Calibri, right? This is sans serif. Times New Roman, right, because it has these serifs, this is a serif font. So serif versus sans serif is basically just whether or not your font has a serif, or has serifs. Now, different fonts will have a different degree of serifs. Some will make the serifs extremely pronounced, others will make them less pronounced, or maybe they will be distributed differently on different letters. Some will have them on most letters, some will have them on relatively few. But generally, you have serif, meaning they're there, and sans serif, meaning they're not. And in addition to sort of the X height, it is probably one of the most important decisions you can make about a font is whether you want to pick something that is serif or sans serif. And there are compelling reasons to do both, and there are stylistic reasons potentially to choose one over another. But understanding what that is fundamentally is going to be extremely important in justifying your decisions that you make relative to fonts in your layout. The other key thing to keep in mind about fonts is actually something called stroke width. I'm going to try and do this in green here. So stroke width is actually the width of the letter, of the piece of the letter, right? So this distance right here, right, those are called stroke width, or stroke. Stroke or stroke width. So again, to reiterate, visually we can see that, but what stroke width is, it's basically the width of the drawn portion of the font. Alternatively, you can think of it as how thick the lines of the letters are. Right? It's how thick the lines of the letters are. So this, just like X height, is going to be really important in determining what kind of font you want, because X height and stroke width play a very important role along with serif versus sans serif in readability, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. Now there are a couple of other components of font, things like ascenders and descenders. We're not going to talk about them. They're definitely mentioned in the textbooks, and I think they're important, but X height, stroke width, and serif and sans serif are really the three things that you need to know above all else for being able to pick an appropriate font. Okay, so that's the anatomy of the font. Hopefully that makes sense. Pause the video, make sure that you have this written down, that you understand these different components, because now we're going to move on to things that go beyond the actual font and deal with more of how we structure multiple words together and multiple lines together. And the first thing that we're going to talk about relative to that is this idea of size. Right? And I mentioned before that we have this idea of X height, which was the height of the lowercase x, or cap height, which is the height of the flat top on a capital letter. And I said that those two things help dictate one font relative to another. But we can also change the size of the font by actually changing what's called the point size. Now, point size is sort of this carryover term from the printing press, but basically what it is it's a ratio of the size of the font. And what I mean by that is generally 1 point is 1/72 of an inch when printed. Right, so you could imagine back in the day of the printing press when they had to actually put the little metal discs into the printing presses that would actually press the letter down onto the paper. Right, when you would do point sizes, you would actually be measuring the size of those discs. The bigger the disc, the larger the font. But you can also imagine that within that disc, right, let me actually try and draw this, right? So if we have a disc like this, right, the size of this disc here, this would be the point size. Right, so if you make the disc larger, right, you have a larger point size, but then you can imagine also that within that disc, right, you'd actually have the letter, say for example, X, right? So point size refers to the size of the disc. Generally speaking, 1 point was 1/72 of an inch when printed, but the X height actually could vary from font to font and would determine how much of that block or piece that the actual letter took up when doing the printing. So point size is just this sort of carryover from the printing press. Generally speaking, the larger the point size, the bigger the font. Or the bigger the letters, I should say. So what I've done here in this illustrative diagram is I actually have 3 different point sizes or font sizes. I have 11, 16, and 28. And what you'll notice is that as we increase the point size, right, the letters get bigger. Now, just like before, we have Times New Roman and Calibri, but what I want you to notice is that even though we're increasing the size of the letters, you'll notice that comparing the 2 fonts, right, they are still different heights. So that's why when I was trying to illustrate with this is that point size is generally speaking the size of the template that was used to make the letter, versus X height refers to the actual size of the character within that template. So point size, generally speaking the size, X height is going to give you sort of a good indication of within a point size whether or not the font is going to be bigger or smaller relative to another font. So hopefully this reinforces the concept both of point size, larger is bigger, and also of the difference between that X height that we talked about before. So hopefully this makes sense. The next thing that I want to talk about is how we can combine multiple words and multiple lines of words together, and some of the different characteristics that we can manipulate. So this isn't dealing with font so much anymore. This is dealing with how we can manipulate multiple words and multiple lines of any given font. And there's really 2 things that we can manipulate here. The first is called line spacing, or sometimes you'll see it called leading. Right? And if you've ever worked with Microsoft Word before and you've ever had to turn in a paper that was, say, double-spaced, triple-spaced, or single-spaced, right, that's talking about line spacing. And if you've ever been trying frantically to finish an essay and you've adjusted that distance a little bit, what you're actually adjusting is the line spacing. But what I want to do here is I want to actually set this up as a definition relative to the terms that we already know. So line spacing or leading is really defined as the distance between one baseline and the next. Right, the distance between one baseline and the next. So what I've got, we should be okay. What I want to show you here is that this diagram that I drew that we have down here, we have 2 different leadings. So this is times 1, so this is normal leading, and this is times 3. And so what we're actually measuring here in terms of the distance is, so we have, this right here, this is baseline 1, and this right here is baseline 2. And so what leading is actually measuring is this distance here. So this distance right here, that distance is your line spacing or your leading. And I do want to throw out one more term. When we're dealing with ArcGIS Pro specifically, you will also sometimes see this called gap or gap distance. And it will be given in that point unit, which is, again, 1 point is 1/72nd of an inch when printed. So we can look at this one that has a much higher leading, right? And again, to reinforce the concept here, right, we have this baseline here, and we have this baseline here, right? And if we measure that distance between those two baselines, again, right, that's our gap, line spacing, or leading, depending on what reference you're looking at or what software you're using. Okay, so that's line spacing or leading, and that can be very useful for when we place labels and annotations. You can imagine that having this spacing might help you fill in the space of a polygon so that the label fits better within the geometry, or maybe you can use line spacing to improve readability by giving the user a little more space between the characters. So that's a really effective use of line spacing, and we're going to look at some examples of that in a future video. The other thing that we can manipulate here is we can manipulate what's called the actual distance between the characters in words. And that there's sort of two things we can manipulate there. The first is called kerning, and the second is called tracking. And they do mostly the same thing, but they work slightly differently. So what kerning does, we'll focus on kerning first. Right, kerning keeps track of the space between each individual character in the word. Right. Denotes the space between each character in a word. Right, and so if we look here, we have two different levels of kerning. The top one here, this is normal, and the bottom one has a 3-point kerning. And what we're measuring, just to sort of, again, kind of like we did with line spacing and leading, what we're actually measuring here is the distance between one letter and the next. So I'm going to try my best to draw a straight line here. Right, this distance right here, that's very poorly drawn, but that distance, that's the kerning. Right, conversely, down here we have a larger kerning. So that would be, you know, this distance right here. This would also be kerning. Now, just like with line spacing and with point size for font size, generally speaking, a larger kerning means letters are farther apart, right? So that's kerning. An alternative way that we could approach this problem would be through tracking. Now, tracking, instead of specifically designating a distance between individual characters, what tracking will do is it will try to make all of the characters fit within a given area. So it focuses more so on the average distance between characters to make the entire word fit within a given area. So tracking will manipulate distance between letters to make a word fit a given area. So you can think of this, again, going back to Microsoft Office or Microsoft Word, right? You can think of this when you have something like justify. When you take it so that it justifies the entire page, it spreads the words apart, right? That's tracking. So kerning, you specify a specific distance and each character gets that distance. With tracking, you specify an area that you want the entire word or words to cover, and then it will manipulate those distances so that the word fits that area. Hopefully that makes sense. I know this is a little bit confusing. I'm going to reiterate that one more time. So kerning lets you denote the space you want, and each character gets that space. Tracking says, I want this word to cover this area, and then it manipulates that space to make the words fit the area. Hopefully that makes sense. So what I want to do is I want to actually end this video by giving some best practices for choosing fonts. Choosing fonts and using text. Because again, right, text is everywhere on the map. So making good, effective choices about font and how we use text is going to have a major impact on the overall aesthetics and usability of the final map or layout. So, number 1, serif fonts are generally easier to read So in general, you're going to want to use serif fonts, especially when the fonts are a little bit smaller, because those serifs help the eye differentiate letters. Two, in general, a larger X height and stroke width will result in greater readability especially when you're dealing with a small font size. Right, because again, all things being equal, comparing two fonts, right, X height and stroke width are going to make the font itself look bigger. Three, do not use all caps. Right, we didn't talk too much about capitalization, but as a general rule, unless you have a very good reason to do otherwise, avoid using all caps. What you generally want to use is you want to use one of two things. You either want to use something called sentence case, where the first word of each sentence is capitalized, or you want to use something called title case. And that's where the first letter of each word is capitalized. All right, if you use these two, you're going to improve readability. If you use all caps, you fall into one of two pitfalls. One, it's going to make your map look very angry because all caps tends to denote some sort of yelling emotion. And also, it just, generally speaking, is much less readable because distinguishing between capital letters when everything is capitalized is actually a lot more difficult than distinguishing between lowercase. 4. High contrast improves readability. Now I'm going to show you what I mean here. Right, this is high contrast, okay contrast, low contrast, and terrible contrast. Right, in fact, you probably couldn't even see the last line that I wrote. So in general, when you're picking fonts, you want to pay attention to contrast, both in terms of the where you place the font, but also the colors. Are you using white on black, or are you using like a dark yellow on a light yellow, which would be not a good idea. So think about contrast. Five, this is something that a lot of people often try to overdo, and that is reduce the overall number of different font types in your map. Generally, I would say only use 2 to 3. Right? Because if you get beyond that, then you're going to start to have the reader be more confused. They're going to have to work harder because the different font types are just going to be generally more of a strain on the user. So you generally want to keep 2 to 3. Maybe have one for your title, one for your other text that's not part of the main element, and then maybe 1 or 2 for the different labels in the map. And finally, number 6, avoid unusual fonts, italics, and bolds. Right? Just because a font looks artistic, so something like Bradley HTC or any of the cursive fonts, right? Just because they look artistic doesn't mean that they're going to be effective when you use them in a map, because again, just like rule number 5, right, people are going to have to work harder to read them, which is going to detract from the overall purpose of your map. If it takes me a long time to read your text, I'm not focusing on what you're trying to tell me. I'm focusing on just trying to interpret what the physical characters that are on the page. So generally avoid things like, again, Bradley HTC, even Comic Sans sometimes. Avoid those sort of unusual fonts and italics and bolds unless you have a very good reason to use them. So for example, scientific names, you might be, well actually you are required to put them in italics. Bold is really good for highlighting specific things, but you certainly don't want to put it, you don't want your entire, every single bit of text to be bold. Okay? So hopefully that makes sense. I think if you follow these 6 rules, you should be well on your way to picking good text. And just to recap, generally speaking, you want to go with serif. You want a larger X height and stroke width, especially if you're working with smaller point font sizes. You never want to use all caps. You want to either use sentence case or title case. You always want to be thinking about contrast, both in terms of the layout of the font itself relative to the characteristics, but also things like color and placement. And finally, basically keep it simple. Don't use complicated fonts unnecessarily. Don't make things bold or italic unless you have a reason to. And try to limit yourself to no more than 4 fonts on a given map. So hopefully this all makes sense. And as always, if you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you.